This man's name is Joe. He is a Los Angeles police officer who, due to legal troubles, has now been reassigned to the 911 Customer Service Division. At that time, he was very busy receiving a lot of emergency calls from the public. On his first day working as customer service, Joe was truly exhausted from receiving emergency calls that rang every minute. But it turned out, not only he was overwhelmed, but all his colleagues in the room were also struggling to receive emergency calls. Even his boss himself never stopped being called. Los Angeles is one of the cities with the highest crime rates in America. Not only that, the situation has become worse due to forest fires in most areas of America. Everyone in the room was too busy to even have time to brew coffee or buy sugar. Back at work, Joe also received an emergency call from a woman named Emily. On the phone, Emily was heard crying and speaking unclearly. Joe felt strange and planned to hang up the call, but suddenly a man's voice was heard. Joe realized that Emily was giving him a code indicating that she was kidnapped, so the kidnapper wouldn't suspect. Emily pretended to call using her child's name. Joe instructed Emily to answer his questions slowly. After communicating using codes, Joe managed to find out the characteristics of the kidnapper's car, which was a white minivan. While monitoring Emily's location from the GPS signal on her phone, Joe immediately called for help. The kidnapper, who became suspicious, tried to snatch Emily's phone. In the midst of panic, Joe instructed Emily to stay calm and call him again. When the call ended, Joe asked the nearest patrol police from Emily's location to close the road access and check every white minivan passing by. Unfortunately, the police were busy handling the fire. Other police tried to evacuate, and it was impossible to close the road just to save one life. The police then asked Joe to look for information on the kidnapper's car license plate. Hearing this, Joe was frustrated, but no matter how hard he pleaded, the police still instructed him to find out the license plate number of the kidnapped car first. Joe then found out the license plate number of the kidnapper's car. It was quite easy to find Emily's home address and phone number from the police data. When contacted, the call was answered by Emily's 5-year-old daughter, Abby. Terrified, Abby recounted how her father, Henry, came home with a knife, then forced her mother into the car and left Abby alone with her younger brother, Oliver. Joe immediately sought information about Henry in the police data. All of Henry's personal information appeared, from the address, car license plate number, to the criminal record. Henry had been in and out of jail several times. Seeing this data, Joe was sure that Emily's husband, Henry, was the kidnapper and that Emily was definitely experiencing domestic violence. Worried about disturbing other customer service staff, Joe decided to move rooms. Then he tried to ask for help from his superiors at the police station to help save Emily. But the superior was angry and instructed him to focus more on solving his own case rather than insisting on helping someone else. The superior had instructed all Los Angeles police officers to give false testimony so that Joe could escape the law and the police's good name could be maintained. The superior also instructed Joe to carry out his duties as customer service according to SOP only, without getting too involved in other people's problems. If his sentence is over, then Joe can return to being a field officer again sooner. Joe fell silent for a moment, memories of his case from a few months ago beginning to resurface. He then called his wife. On the phone, Joe reminded his wife to come on time according to the schedule of the trial tomorrow to help give false testimony. Joe's wife actually didn't want to be involved in this case, but she felt sorry because Joe kept calling and begging for her help every day. She promised to come to his trial tomorrow. Feeling a bit relieved, Joe waited again for a call from Emily. He didn't care even though his boss forbade it. But as a police officer, Joe couldn't ignore the community in need of help. He was still determined to find a way to help Emily, whatever the risk. Soon after, Abby called. Abby informed that the police had just arrived. Then Abby handed the phone to one of the officers. On the phone, suddenly the officer sounded panicked because his hands were covered in blood. However, he was not injured at all. Hearing this, Joe panicked, and upon inspection, the officer's voice grew louder. The police found Oliver lying stiff in the bathroom, his entire body covered in blood and his stomach split open. In the middle of the conversation, the phone suddenly died. Joe was sure this was Henry's doing. Holding back his anger, he contacted Henry's number. On the phone, Joe posed as a police officer and stated that he knew all of Henry's actions towards his child and wife. Cornered, Henry couldn't say anything, he just kept crying in fear. Joe was disgusted with emotion, also stating that prison wasn't enough for a cruel murderer like Henry. Joe then said if he managed to catch him later, he would make Henry be sentenced to death. After saying that, the phone call was cut off. Joe then asked for help from his colleague at the police station named Rick. There he heard the sound of several people laughing. He realized they must be drunk at the bar. Joe reminded Rick not to drink too much and to prepare to be a witness at the trial tomorrow. Just like Joe's wife earlier, Rick was actually afraid the lies would be exposed. If Joe wasn't his friend, then he wouldn't want to give false testimony in front of the judge. Joe calmed them down by saying that everything was okay. He promised that once this case was over, Joe wouldn't cause any more trouble. When he had calmed down, Joe, who was talking about Emily, then asked Rick to go to Henry's apartment to look for clues as to where the kidnapped Emily was. As Rick left, suddenly Emily called again. On the phone, Joe asked how Emily was doing. Emily replied that she was sitting in the front seat next to Henry. Joe asked again how fast the car was going. And Emily, who didn't know about cars, could only answer that the car was going very fast, making her scared. In the middle of the conversation, Henry's voice was heard angrily, trying to snatch the phone from Emily's hand. Hearing the commotion, Joe asked again if Emily was currently wearing a seatbelt. Emily said no. After getting an idea of the situation inside the car, Joe then instructed Emily to immediately put on her seatbelt and pull the car's handbrake as hard as possible. Then the call was cut off. Joe could only hope that Emily would report back as soon as possible. While waiting, he contacted the patrol police to check the situation at Emily's last GPS location. Minutes passed until finally, Emily called again. She informed him that Joe's plan had failed. When she tried to escape earlier, Henry had caught her, and now Emily was locked in the back of the car. Joe then calmed Emily down by saying that he had a second plan. Joe asked what hard objects were inside there. After searching, Emily found a brick. Joe then instructed Emily to be ready if the car stopped later, and Henry opened the back door. Then Emily should immediately hit Henry on the head as hard as she could with the brick, and then run as far away as possible from there. Emily had slowly stopped crying since Joe had talked to her, and she complained that she didn't understand why Rick was angry, especially since she was just trying to get the snake out of her second child, Oliver's stomach. Joe asked Emily to recount everything in as much detail as possible. Emily explained that Oliver had been crying non-stop all day, as if he was enduring stomach pain. Out of pity for his suffering child, he decided to cut open Oliver's stomach, and immediately, Oliver stopped crying. Emily felt relieved that her child was freed from pain. Hearing all this, Joe fell silent, realizing his assumptions had been wrong all along. Suddenly, the sound of Henry opening the back door of the car was heard just as Emily was locked in. According to plan, Emily hit Henry on the head with a brick, and the call was disconnected again. Then Rick called to report that he had found a clue after searching through Henry's belongings at home. Rick found a bill from a mental hospital in the name of Henry's wife, Emily. Joe was so shocked and trembling that he tried to contact Henry. When the call was answered, Henry could be heard crying in pain because his head was covered in blood from the brick hit earlier. Joe knew Emily had escaped far away. Henry then told Joe the real story. Henry's intention in taking Emily was to return her to the mental hospital, even though he knew the hospital would refuse because Henry had no money and the previous bill had not been paid. Nevertheless, Henry was determined to go there to protect his children. On the other hand, even though they were divorced, Henry still loved Emily and worried that if the police found out about Emily's actions, she would be arrested. After the call ended, Joe felt it was all his fault. If only he hadn't helped Emily, and if only he hadn't interfered in someone else's domestic affairs, then this incident wouldn't have happened. Shortly after, Emily called again and told him she was on a flyover. While answering Joe's questions, Emily suddenly saw a lot of blood on her hands. Instantly, Emily remembered what she had done to her own child. She continued to cry, regretting her actions, repeatedly saying she didn't deserve to live in this world anymore. Even though she was calmed down, Emily kept crying sadly. Emily then said she wanted to jump off the flyover to follow Oliver to heaven. Joe felt a pang of pain, saying that no matter Emily's past mistakes, she still deserved to live. Joe believed that if anyone didn't deserve to live in this world, it was Joe. He knew exactly how Emily felt because Joe had also killed someone. Crying, Joe confessed all his sins, the sins that now required him to serve a sentence. A few months ago, while still working as a field officer, he accidentally shot a young man in the street to death. Joe also informed that tomorrow he would attend the first trial for his murder case. He explained that both he and Emily were sinners. They both felt the weight of their wrongdoings, but Emily should remember there's Henry who always gives her encouragement. All his words seemed to calm Emily for a moment. However, when the sound of police sirens approached, Emily panicked again and stated that she still wanted to follow Oliver to heaven. The call was then disconnected. Joe felt deeply saddened. He kept calling Emily repeatedly, even though her number was no longer active, until finally, Joe's call was answered. Unfortunately, it wasn't Emily who picked up the phone, but the police, who informed him that they had managed to save Emily before she jumped. Hearing this news, Joe also cried tears of joy. A few minutes later, his superior came to inform him that Emily's second child, Oliver, had been successfully rescued and was now being treated in the hospital. Joe could only feel more relieved and then went to the bathroom. From this incident, Joe realized that Emily's case was a reflection of himself. He used to easily advise others while he himself tried to bury his sins, run from responsibility. Joe also decided to face reality, even if it meant going to jail, being fired. After tarnishing the police's good name, he would not run anymore. Joe then contacted each witness for the trial tomorrow and asked them to testify as honestly as possible. And so the film ends. If you like this video, don't forget to subscribe, because by subscribing you have supported me to make better videos. See you in the next video.